I can't remember a time when I didn't love Tolkien, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. I loved him when I was spiritually sort of floating adolescence. I loved him when I was an atheist graduate student. And I also feel that, yes, that sort of hidden light in the books did do a lot to draw me in to the faith, to becoming a Christian and ultimately to becoming a Catholic. It was so powerful precisely because he wasn't being overt about it. There's nothing propagandistic, there's nothing pushy. It's just so beautiful and it's so resonant. This world that he presents is so appealing. Goodness is meaningful. Evil is recognized. It's not just pretending that it doesn't exist. It's a very compelling world. And the attraction of that and then discovering that the author of this amazingly rich and beautiful world with his wonderful stories, that he was a Christian, definitely piqued my interest and really drew me in.
Welcome to the Barrel-Aged Faith. Today, my special guest is Dr. Holly Ordway. She's the Fellow of Faith and Culture of the Word on Fire Institute. She's got an upcoming book called Tolkien's Faith. She is a visiting professor at Houston Christian University and holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's the author of several books, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, and Not God's Type, an atheist academic lays down her arms. How you doing, Holly?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
So you're also coming out with a new book. It's coming out in September, correct?
Yeah, end of August, beginning of September, to coincide with the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death.
The book is called The Faith of Tolkien, a spiritual biography.
Well, almost right. It's called Tolkien's Faith, a spiritual biography.
September is like my favorite month. It's my birthday, but I try to always read something from Tolkien during that month. I try to find Hobbit stuff, drink some extra tea that month. It's just a wonderful month. So I'm happy that your book's coming out end of August throughout September. What are some quick examples in Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, where maybe a Christian idea, a Christian theme pops up? How did he integrate that into his, massive work, Lord of the Rings?
A lot of people try to kind of compartmentalize Tolkien because they don't see that the Lord of the Rings is a Christian book because it doesn't have any, to their eyes, religious elements in it. And so they think, well, then he may have been a Christian privately, but it didn't influence his work. And yet Tolkien himself said, this is the statement with which I open Tolkien's Faith. He himself said that the Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the writing, but consciously in the revision. So he's very deliberate about it. He himself says that his Christian faith is fundamental to this work. But the curious thing about what he says in this passage is that after making that point, he goes on to say that this deliberate, conscious Christian element in the revision was why he cut out all the overt religious references. And it can be very easy to read that and think, is there a typo here? Has he reversed his words? But no, he's deliberately cut out the things that would draw your attention to it precisely because of its fundamental nature. And there are many other places that I point out and discuss in Tolkien's Faith where he explains the way that it's implicit, it's infused, it's part of the atmosphere, you might say, or the soil or the bedrock of the Lord of the Rings. So with that in mind, to say what are the Christian elements, it's really important to always keep in mind that Tolkien worked quite hard to make sure that nothing was going to be obvious. It's not an allegory. He was very annoyed when people thought it was an allegory. This equals that, this equals that. But he was also equally annoyed when people said that there was no religion in the book. So it's that delicate sort of balance that makes the Christian element in Lord of the Rings, I think, both so compelling and so interesting to look at. So all of that as prelude, I would point out that one aspect that we see this religious element coming out is the way that there are a number of different Christ figures in the story, because he's sort of giving us pictures of kind of who Christ is. Now, he's very clear this is a pre-Christian story. He doesn't write about the incarnation. He's very clear that he's not doing that. But we have, for instance, in Aragorn, a kind of image of Christ as king. The king who's also the healer, the king who's unknown. In Gandalf, we have an image of the resurrected Christ, who dies for his people and then he comes back. in Frodo and Sam, we have an image of Christ, the suffering servant, as they're going on this long trek to Mordor to save others. So these are not allegorical figures. And I think the fact there are multiple ones helps us see that. But the fact is that as a Christian, he had thought through very deeply, who is Christ and how do we see him in the world? And out of that, we get some of this imagery of the different ways that we can see Christ in these different figures.
Thank you for bringing up the prophet, priest, and king example. I know there's so many. That one particularly spoke to me in high school because I there was a couple years, kind of sophomore, junior year, where I kind of strayed away from the faith for a bit. But I was really into Lord of the Rings, and I was watching the movies, I was reading the books, I was reading all the background information. And it was about senior year that I kind of started coming back to the faith. I was going to go study theology in college. And so I started reading just lots of volumes. And I was reading a Baptist work. I cannot remember the author, but he had a whole chapter on prophet, priest, and king. And my connections with Lord of the Rings, I was like, I wonder if Tolkien meant the prophet, priest, and king to come through those three figures. And then, of course, scholars and pastors started preaching on that. So thank you for bringing that up. It's a great example.
This is sort of thing that he calls applicability, which rests, as he put it, rests in the freedom of the reader to make these connections. And that's one of the reasons why Lord of the Rings is so powerful, because you don't have to recognize these connections to be deeply moved by Frodo, by Gandalf, by Aragorn. That's part of the accessibility of it, that it's illuminating it further for those who have eyes to see, but it's not foisting it on you, and it's not requiring you to recognize it to feel the power of it.
Right. By no means. I mean, Frodo kind of almost fails in being a priest, right? I mean, you expect him to be victorious at the end, and he can't do it.
Well, that's part of the subtlety of Tolkien, because he's very clear in his letters that Frodo fails in the quest. He gets to the final point, he gets to the critical point, and he denies the quest. He says, no, I will not do it. And he seizes the ring for himself. He fails. And this, for Tolkien, becomes a meditation. He makes a meditation on the last passage of the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And Frodo has precisely been taken past the point of his endurance. His will has been broken by the power of the ring. But because he willingly gave himself up to that, because he exercised mercy, which is a theme that is so important, a religious theme so important in the Lord of the Rings, he exercises mercy and pity. Because of that, providentially, he is saved through his failure. But he does fail. And I think that's a really important point, because Tolkien's not making a simplistic argument about, or a simplistic presentation that, if you just have faith, everything will be okay. And that, I think, is part of the strength of the book. It's so spiritually realistic, because Frodo gives everything and he's broken by it. He fails, it's redeemed. But I think one of the saddest and most moving parts of the book is that he never heals in this life. He goes back to the Shire, and there's that just heart-wrenching line when he says to Sam, yes, the Shire has been saved, but not for me. He's too wounded to even enjoy it. He cannot be healed in this life. His healing has to come in the next life. And that is simply the case so often for us in this life. There are wounds that we will not have healed in this life. So this is a real, I think, spiritual depth and subtlety and realism that Tolkien brings into this.
Yeah, it seems almost therapeutic for those who are really invested in reading these books when you're living just your own life. I mean, those scars that won't heal, the wounds, but there's still like this glimmer of hope that it will be. I saved the word Euchatastrophe for the end of our interview, but we might as well just jump in right now, because Frodo fails. There's a catastrophe, and life's filled with catastrophe. There's evil. There's tons of darkness. all around us. And that's why I think this novel is so powerful. There's just so much darkness, but these bursts of gold. What does this word eucatastrophe that he coined, made up, he made up a lot of words. What does this word mean? And how does it make sense of his faith?
Well, the word eucatastrophe is made up of two parts. There's catastrophe, which we get, the overturning, the upheaval, and then EU, that's where we get, for instance, utopia. It's the Greek for good. So eucatastrophe is the good catastrophe. And for Tolkien, it expresses the happy ending that comes when you think that no happy ending is possible. It's the light that comes when you think that darkness is completely fallen. And one of the things that I talk about in Tolkien's faith is the way that this is really profound, that this is not a correlative of the hope of the optimist, but rather the hope of the pessimist, in a sense. It's when you think everything has ended, when you're sure that it's all done, that there's no happy ending possible, that's when the eucatastrophe comes, that inbreaking of light. And that, Tolkien says, is related to the resurrection. And he says this in his great essay on fairy stories, in the epilogue to that essay. He says that the incarnation is the eucatastrophe of human history, and the resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. And, we can even get used to this story. We know that Christ rises again, but for the disciples, seeing, he was going to be the Messiah and he is now dead. He's dead. Mm-hmm. He's in the tomb. It cannot get any worse than this. This is the end. And so his resurrection is the eucatastrophe par excellence. And so Tolkien argues that the very reason that we respond to a happy ending in fiction, whether we know it or not, is because it's a glimmer of light of that cosmic eucatastrophe. That's why we respond to it. We're catching a glimpse of that light, coming through the story to us.
Yeah, it makes me think of the Emmaus, the Emmaus story in Luke, where they said, we thought he was going to be the one to redeem Israel. And they're walking away from Jerusalem. I mean, giving up on the story. And it's important for us to sometimes feel that a lot more than we do, because we already know the ending. And so to feel that, I think, is important. And you can't really have a sense of that resurrection, that eucatastrophe, without feeling that darkness and loss of hope at first. So,
and I think that's something that a lot of Christian writers and preachers and apologists don't quite trust the power of the eucatastrophe. They want to hurry on to the happy ending without recognizing fully, that we are sitting in darkness in the shadow of death. And as a result, the Christian message can so often seem trite, shallow. Just trust Jesus and everything will be okay. Well, there can be an awful lot of suffering between now and it will eventually be better than okay. But there could be a lot of agony between now and then. And that's part of the process, mysteriously, in some cases. And I think it's so tempting and so harmful to want to skip past that and not fully recognize it, or conversely, to dwell in it, to revel in it, and to forget there is anywhere to go. But I think for Christians, the temptation is stronger to try and just skip over the darkness. And I think that's where biographically it can be so helpful to look at Tolkien's life. And this is something that I unpack in the new book, because his life was full of really dark, difficult, painful moments. And we can talk about some of those. But he had far from an easy life. So he really knew what it was like to live through really difficult, faith testing, trying, painful situations all the way through to the happy ending. His faith was very much hard earned. And I think that spiritual honesty comes through in The Lord of the Rings, which is the fruit of his maturity. We sometimes forget, I think, that The Lord of the Rings was, published when he was in his 60s. it's really the fruit of a very richly lived life, and that depth of just experience.
So his mother died at a young age, and he also fought in World War I. And so he did experience quite a bit of death. How did death shape his spirituality? How did death shape Lord of the Rings?
Well, death is a central theme in The Lord of the Rings, and he says so. He says that death and the desire for deathlessness are the theme of The Lord of the Rings. So this meditation on death is really at the heart of it. What does it mean to encounter it, to face it, to go through it? And yeah, he experienced this from the beginning. I mean, his father died when he was a little boy, when he was 4 years old. And his mother died when he was 12. So he was left an orphan. And that's, a completely wrenching experience, obviously. He loved his mother, and had a very happy life with her and his younger brother. And then he loses her. And then, of course, he just gets his footing as a young man. And there's the cataclysm of the First World War, in which, as he put it quite factually, most of his close friends were killed. The slaughter of men of his generation was horrific, and particularly the slaughter of the college-educated men. The officer class, which is drawn from the universities, had the highest death rate. They were just mown down. So most of his good friends died in the war. And he himself, and I think this is a slightly underrated feature, he was probably saved from death in the trenches by contracting the illness trench fever, and was invalided out and was never sent back. The Army Board kept declaring him disabled repeatedly, and he was never sent back. And then finally the war ended. And it's easy to think, lucky for him, he got out easy. But if you think about it, with the death toll in the trenches, Tolkien was a signals officer. He was a highly valuable officer. They needed every able-bodied man. They were sending men back who had reconstructive face surgery because they had gruesome injuries. They were sending those men back. If they weren't sending back Lieutenant Tolkien's signals officer, it wasn't because they were being nice to him. It was because he was way too sick to serve. And one of the things I did in researching this was to really look into trench fever. And at the time, they didn't know what caused it. They didn't have any treatments for it. And the few things that they tried had no effect. So basically, you had to just take your chances. Most people got over it quickly, but if you didn't, it could become chronic, and become basically a chronic sometimes crippling disease. And Tolkien had it very, very badly. He lost 30 pounds at one point. And for a man who was very lightweight, very lean, he must have been down to skin and bones to lose 30 pounds. He was so sick. And if you look at the accounts of his life later on, his chronic illnesses, he's always getting sick. This is a recurring theme in his letters. He genuinely had, I think, his health damaged permanently by trench fever. So again, here's another burden that he carries, that he not only gets sick so terribly and suffers from it, but he literally carries that burden the rest of his life, along with the losses that he experienced in it. So all of this to say is that the First World War was traumatic in so many ways for him, and yet he retains his faith. He does go through some difficulties later on, but he makes it through the war with his faith intact, with it strong, but also with a real encounter with death, the problem of evil, the problem of suffering. So when he's writing about war in Lord of the Rings, he's not just glorifying something he's only read about in books. He has lived it. And again, this brings this power to it. When he thinks about the meaning of death, his friends died in the war, and he nearly did.
It makes sense why, when you read Lord of the Rings, it's so descriptive and it makes it feel real. Those wars feel real. The forests and the hills and the mountains, they all feel very real. And it's just so cool to see him bringing his own experience into that. So thanks for bringing that up, because I didn't know that about his health, his chronic ailments. So.
Well, that is something that I think has not been picked up by other biographers. It's known that he had trench fever, but we sort of, that's a thing that people had in the First World War. But I went back and researched it and looked at his, looked the accounts of his medical records and thought, this was bad. This really had a much more profound influence on him. He was declared 100% disabled at one point. Can you imagine how sick he must have been to have them declare that?
So again, this is a very well-researched book. Buy it, because you're going to learn a whole lot of new things about Tolkien. I was just talking to somebody about him, and they didn't realize that he was raised by basically a Catholic priest after his mother died. What was that like for him? And because, most people in the West, if you're part of the Eastern Catholic Church, you may have a priest who's a dad. But, in the West, that was kind of uncommon for a Catholic priest to be raising a kid. What was that like for him? And then what was it like just being a Catholic in England, even at that time?
Well, that second question is huge. It's a major part of the book. So I might defer to when you read the book. You'll see all about that. And I think it is just important to note that to be a Catholic in England in the early 1900s was very different from being a Catholic in America at any time. Culturally speaking, very much a minority and disadvantaged position, very different from what we might expect. But coming back to being raised by Father Francis Morgan, who was his guardian. So Father Francis was a member of the Birmingham Oratory, just founded by John Henry Newman. And he'd gotten to know Mabel, Tolkien's mother, befriended the boys. And this friendship, Mabel realized that he would be an ideal guardian for her sons, in part, and this is again something that I turned up in my research for the book, in part because the Birmingham Oratorians, being many of them or even most of them converts from Anglicanism, they understood the difficulties of being a convert, because she had converted to Catholicism in 1900 when Tolkien was 8. So her choosing Father Francis as the boy's guardian was not just kind of good luck or, oh, this happened to be the priest there. She knew that the Oratorians, and Father Francis in particular, understood the pressures that her sons would be under as children of a convert. And so that was a very wise choice. Now, in the Birmingham Oratory, the boys couldn't live there because there was no space for them. So he housed them with various, first with some relatives, and then with, in a lodging house. So they had other folks to take care of them, food and clothing kind of thing, food and shelter. But he was very much their father. In fact, Tolkien called him my second father, and he looked after them. He loved them. He took them on holidays. He looked after their spiritual welfare. He taught Tolkien. Tolkien says this in one of his letters. He says, Father Francis taught him charity and forgiveness. And that's such a remarkable statement that I take a whole chapter to unpack it. But I think it just goes to show that there was a lot of fatherly care going on there. Now, there's also, when Tolkien got older, tension, because as many people know, he fell in love with Edith Bratt, fellow orphan at his lodging house, and they started sort of seeing each other secretly. It was all still very innocent, but the very fact that he was being secretive about it was not a good sign. And he was getting distracted from his studies. He failed his first scholarship exam for Oxford. And this was really crucial because Father Francis was using even some of his own money to pay for the boy's upbringing. But there wasn't money to pay for him to go to Oxford if he didn't get a scholarship. And Father Francis knew that this was his gifting. He needed to go to Oxford. He's got to get a scholarship. And he's mooning over this girl and not studying. So he lays down the law and says, you must not see her. You must not see her until you have reached your age of majority. When you're 21, and you're no longer my ward, that's different. But until then, you cannot see her. And it's such a fascinating chapter in Tolkien's life. And we have to really enter into it because Tolkien obeys him. And it doesn't destroy their relationship. That's the really remarkable thing, because he says, I must obey Father Francis. But again, I spend a lot of time in the book unpacking, well, what did he mean by must? he admits that when he got to Oxford, he could have, he says, deceived his guardian. He could have written to Edith or met her, and Father Francis wouldn't have known. But he chose not to, because he was his second father and he owed him all the love of a father. So he chose to obey Father Francis, not because he was being bullied into it or he was afraid his money was going to get cut off. He chose to because it was the right thing to do. Now, as soon as he turns 21, boom, he writes to Edith, he reconnects, but he did obey his second father. And there's some time that they have to kind of get back into the relationship again, but they do. And then Father Francis becomes a family friend, and he becomes a grandfatherly presence then for Tolkien's children. He goes on holidays with them. And this is such a remarkable story of genuine fatherly son love, forgiveness, and this strange virtue of obedience that we don't tend to see as a virtue. But it plays out just so fruitfully in Tolkien's own life.
He eventually meets C.S. Lewis. Many people know about their relationship. That's very well written about, and it's talked about. But what was it about their faith and their friendship that brought them together? You know, we talk about iron sharpening iron. How did they sharpen each other? Maybe in good ways and fun ways, but maybe sometimes maybe got a little intense with each other too.
Well, the interesting thing is that their faith was not what brought them together, because when they met, Tolkien was a Catholic, but Lewis was an atheist. He was still in his atheist phase. Lewis had sort of grown up nominally Christian, but had abandoned his faith entirely by his teens. And by the time that he, was at Oxford and was lecturing and Tolkien and met him, he was not a believer. So they bonded over literature, over the Norse sagas. They had a shared love of the Norse sagas. And Lewis joined this club that called the Kolbiters, the Kolbitar, that Tolkien had founded to read Norse sagas in the original, as one does. And they discovered that they shared so many literary interests. And Tolkien very sort of tentatively and fearfully and trustingly showed Lewis a copy of a poem that he had written that came out of the Legendarium, the Lay of Leithian, which was part of this developing material that we will eventually see in the Silmarillion. It's very dear to his heart. He shares it with Lewis, and Lewis loves it and gives a really fruitful commentary on it, but not just to, I loved it, but pushing back on parts of it, saying, well, no, this isn't quite good enough. But that invigorates Tolkien, and they become friends. And it's through Tolkien's influence, along with some other folks, but very strongly Tolkien's influence, that Lewis becomes a Christian. And so we have an instance there of Tolkien's influence on Lewis. And I think that iron sharpening iron was already happening there, because Lewis's questions and challenges would have, sharpened Tolkien's own faith. And then they both become, they're both Christians. And then there's this great friendship where they're able to have that in common. Are there still points of conflict? Of course there are. And again, this is something that I talk about in the book. Lewis has got 2 separate chapters. He's such an important part of Tolkien's life. But it's such a fruitful friendship throughout Tolkien's whole life.
I think I've read about maybe Tolkien maybe not always caring for the mishmash sort of randomness of Narnia, but he didn't know Father Michael Ward yet, right? The hidden layer. So if you haven't watched my interview with Father Michael Ward and the Planet Narnia and the Narnia Code, you got to check that out. But Tolkien, it sounds like maybe he didn't see that medieval layer quite yet. In maybe reading it, or
and actually, this is something, in Tolkien's modern reading, my previous Tolkien book, I go into in some detail, because there's this idea. You put it very, very appropriately and very mildly, but there's this idea of like, Tolkien hated Narnia. No, he did not. He did not. He didn't care for it. Although later in life, he even said to one correspondent, he says that the Narnia Chronicles are, quote, deservedly very popular. He thought they merited their popularity, and he had them for his grandchildren to read. So that, to me, really speaks volumes, because he was very attentive to his grandchildren and his children and his grandchildren's reading. So he thought they were a bit of a mishmash. And it is funny, because I honestly agree with you that, if he could jump forward in time and read Planet Narnia, or have had managed to twist Jack's arm to get him to tell him the underlying, symbolism that he was so utterly secretive about, he would have thought, this is cool. But as it was, he didn't get it, and didn't care for it. But we can.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I think Bishop Barron may have said that he considers Tolkien to be maybe one of the greatest evangelists of the 20th century. Who do you think's been more effective, Lewis or Tolkien, or can we even separate the two of them?
I don't think that's even a good question to ask, because they're not in competition, and they're doing different things in different ways. And that's something I think is important just to recognize. They can become a little bit conflated with each other. They're both Christians. They're both at Oxford. They both write fantasy. They're best friends. And then they're becoming this sort of composite figure. But personality-wise, they were very different. And one of the ways, for instance, is just the way that they socialize. Tolkien was always quieter in public, whereas Lewis was very, loud and boisterous. And then in their writing, Lewis, wanted to put more overt, presentations of the Christian faith. And he did apologetics, nonfiction, wonderful works like Mere Christianity. The only instance we have of Tolkien's published apologetics is the poem Mythopoeia, which is sadly not very well known. But insofar as he's going to present a case for Christianity, he does it in poetry, not, in explicit prose. They're just doing different things in different ways because their personalities are different. And so their impact, I think, is equally great, but you can't measure it. It's like they're just different. They're contributing different things.
They just seem so intertwined. And it's almost like, you can study history, particularly church history, and you see these saints where it's like, well, you just couldn't have one without the other. St. Francis and St. Clare. And you could just go down the list.
I mean, you're quite right. You can't compare them, but I think you are accurate in saying we wouldn't have one without the other. That, I think, is very fair to say, because if Tolkien hadn't been present in Lewis's life, quite possibly Lewis wouldn't have become a Christian. Or if he did, and it's quite probably that it would have, but it would have been later. Would a Lewis who had converted later, after that productive sort of sweet spot in his career, would he have written the Screwtape Letters or or Mere Christianity? We might not have those books if it weren't for the fact that Tolkien helps him make the step at a pivotal point in his career. And then if we look at Lord of the Rings, Tolkien is very forthright. He says he would never have finished it if it hadn't been for Lewis's constant encouragement. So if it weren't for Lewis, we would not have the Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
So their friendship really is pivotal to the work of both of them. It's such an amazing friendship.
I'm just glad you're sharing that, because I just think the power of faith is what is possible in friendships now in our present reality. And so we see this fragmentation in our world and collapse of friendship, collapse of community all around the world, isolation and depression. And so the two of them, I think, really just provide this wonderful example of what friendship can do, and how it can provide hope in your day-to-day life.
Absolutely. And that's actually a theme that I trace in the new book, in Tolkien's faith, in a variety of ways. In a sense, I think Tolkien had a bit of a genius for friendship. And I think that's something that we really need to recover.
Frodo and Sam challenged my own sense and reflection of my friendships in college, and even after that. So he did it. He gave us a gift, I think. When it comes to the ending of Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia, this is my silly comparative question. Which ending do you tend to like better? I know this is kind of one of those heart-wrenching questions, but it's fun. Which one do you think communicates maybe this theme of Euchatastrophe better?
This is a terrible question. No, I mean, you've just heard me saying that they're doing different things in different ways, and then you ask this ridiculous question. Well, you think about it, they're really presenting, in one sense, the same, in a certain sense, the same or similar concept, which is that we're passing from this life into the next. And they're giving a glimpse of the beauty that is beyond, that the life that we're living now is only the beginning. It's the first stage, and that what comes after, if we trust in the Lord, is going to be better. Now, that immediately becomes complicated by the fact that Lord of the Rings is set in a pre-Christian era, so it is all evoked and thematic, whereas The Last Battle is explicitly has a Christ figure, and who even tells the children, you know me in your world, but by another name. Okay, so that's a difference in how explicit they can be about the nature of the hope that they're looking forward to. But we're even getting a difference in perspective, because in Lord of the Rings, we see Frodo setting sail, for the Undying Lands. He's going west, and we get a slight glimmer of a glimpse of it as Frodo, heads out. But that's it. And in The Last Battle, okay, we do get the trauma that we see Narnia being destroyed. Sorry, spoiler for all of your readers who've not yet read Narnia. This is pretty terrifying. It's in a way much more traumatic than what we get in The Lord of the Rings, because we still have we have the appendices that tell us that Sam becomes mayor and he has all these children and is lovely. But in The Last Battle, we also get a glimpse of the children actively engaging in heaven. We see them, climbing up. We see them unable to be afraid, which is such a brilliant touch. By Jove, one can't, even if one tries. By Jove, as Michael Ward has so beautifully unpacked significance of even little references like that. So in one sense, then we get a more vivid picture of the reality of heaven, whereas Tolkien is only giving us the sort of glimmer of hopefulness. So we need both. We need both to be able to envision, in some sense, it's going to be fantastic. Whatever we get in The Last Battle in those closing pages, it'll be even better than that. But at the same time, Tolkien was in many ways quite depressed as a personality. He could be very cheerful and joyful, but he could also have very depressive moments. And so he's able to give us, I think, much more than Lewis, that sense of, well, we've just got to keep on keeping on, even if it's only a faint glimmer ahead of us. So different things in different ways. They're both amazing. So good. Yeah. It's kind of how I feel when people ask me about eschatology and if I prefer the Eastern tradition or the Western tradition in Christianity. And it's like, well, I think they bring it together. If I look at Tolkien and Lewis, Tolkien is giving us kind of like this ending of rest. Frodo's looking for rest. The Shire is at rest. It's a very homey place. You see kind of like this cosmic renewal, but it's a very restful, peaceful type of renewal. And in the Christian West, Thomas Aquinas and the other great thinkers really emphasize resting in the beatific vision and resting in heaven. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, it's very much further up and further in. Like St. Gregory of Nyssa is very much about heaven is this constant reaching out and almost kind of like infinite growth. And it's interesting that you say that too, because, if we just look at Lord of the Rings, that's only giving us one expression of it. Tolkien's short story, Leaf by Niggle, fantastic story. It gives us another glimpse of it, perhaps, more similar to The Last Battle than Lord of the Rings. Because in Leaf by Niggle, we have the story of the protagonist, Niggle, major spoilers for everyone, that's okay. He dies and he experiences purgatory, the workhouse. And then he's part of this purgatorial experience as he goes out of the workhouse. He's overcome some of his faults. He's gardening with the help of his neighbor Parish, who has also now died and has joined him. And at the end, we get Niggle going off to the mountains. So here, this is what Tolkien called his purgatorial story. It's about purgatory. Tolkien himself says it's about purgatory. So he could write allegory and wanted to. He just didn't want anybody labeling things as allegory that weren't. So Leaf by Niggle is an allegory. It's about purgatory. And here you see a very active image of the next life. Purgatory itself is very active. He's learning new habits. He's becoming healed through doing things. He's not just sitting there. He's planting gardens. He's doing things, and then he's going up into the mountains. Very much a Lewisian kind of image. So it's worth reading. I think it's not as well known as it ought to be.
Oh yeah, I was actually working on a fictional book about purgatory, and I had a good professor friend referenced Leaf by Niggle, and I was like, he's like, you got to read it, and so I did, and it definitely reading Lewis's Great Divorce, which has some similarities with the mountains and the hills, and letting go of selfishness. That kind of that's the purgatorial pain, is us letting go of that which we don't want to let go of. Yeah, and so Great Divorce and Leaf by Niggle, they really unlocked a lot of sort of creative reflection on this controversial doctrine of purgatory. Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought that up. I even referenced that in my book right here, The Ascent. I've got even a little slight shadow of Leaf by Niggle in one of the scenes of a little good shepherd coming down the hillside.
Excellent.
So read Leaf by Niggle. You can find it online for free all over the place. It's a great work by Tolkien. You have these two great men, and of course this book isn't about Lewis, but you said two chapters. You have these two great men. What would you say we can learn from them about our own Christian life? I know that they deeply influenced you because I read your book, Not God's Type, and they're both just intertwined in your own story from atheism to Christianity. How can we apply, their faith, their stories to our lives?
Well, it's such a great question. And I think in this case, they both have the same answer for looking at both of them. One of the things that Walter Hooper, Tolkien's literary executor and friend, said was that Lewis was the most thoroughly converted man that he had ever met. That when he became a Christian, it changed the totality of his life. There was no atom of Lewis that had not become converted. Now, that didn't mean he was perfect, but it meant that there was nothing he was trying to hold apart, or, well, I'll be Christian in my writing, but I'm not. No, it was the whole thing. Everything that he did was shaped by this faith that he had embraced. And I was really moved in researching and writing Tolkien's faith to find that this was really the case for Tolkien as well. And I didn't fully appreciate that myself. I knew he was devout, that he had a very strong faith. That was what prompted me to write the book, to explore this, that I knew he had. But I didn't fully appreciate the way that his faith commitment affected every aspect of his life. And this has not been properly explored. It affected, his personal life, his friendships, the way that he interacted with people, his own devotional life, his prayer life. It shaped the way that he was an academic. He was very active as a role model of a Catholic academic at Oxford. And this was a very interesting thing to find out. He was very prominent as a Catholic professor at a time when that had a social cost. It would not have made him more popular at all. He, in fact, would have got on better with his Anglican colleagues if he had muted his Catholicism. But he didn't. He was prominently there. He showed up at Catholic events. He flew the flag. He was very visibly active in Catholic academia in Oxford. And that's a small world, even smaller then. So he was, again, choosing to prioritize his faith, even when it cost him in small ways. Like, he lived out this daily life of his faith. And I think that's, again, like Lewis, these are not men who were ultimately called to give up their lives for their faith, or to make an overtly, they didn't go off be missionaries in some place and do some dramatic big thing. They just got on with the work they had to do. as Christians. And they did it day in, day out, fair weather and foul, they did it, both of them. And that, I think, is certainly for me a very bracing kind of example, because it makes me think, well, there's no waiting around to, well, when I get the memo about the big thing I'm supposed to do, then I'll do it. Like, no, God is calling me to be faithful right now in every little thing that I do, however trivial it might seem or however tedious. No, right here, right now. That's what Lewis did. That's what Tolkien did. And I think that is a great thing to take away from them.
You're reminding me of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, who is like the patron saint of world missions, but she never left. She never left her cloistered, cell, and died at the age of 23. And so you don't have to, go travel the world and be a world evangelist to be someone who loves the Lord and shares that with the world through your gifts that he's given you. And sometimes these are very small ways. Just be a good father, be a good friend. And it can go a very long way.
Especially because if we think about both Lewis and Tolkien, for most of their lives, they had no idea that their writing was going to be this important. They had, even at the height of their fame in their lives, it was a fraction of what it is today. As I said, Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings didn't start being published until 1954. He was only a couple of years away from retirement at the University of Oxford at that point. So he published The Hobbit, which was a success, but it was a success of a, sort of moderate kind. It wasn't worldwide fan base success. He was just getting on with it. And again, with Lewis, he was popular, but he would not have predicted that he would be so famous as he is now. So they had to just get on with it, not having any idea of their impact. They might have just died being totally obscure for all they knew. And yet they carried on being faithful. It's just fantastic.
That's the story of our faith. The Lord said, you'll do greater things than I. It's always one of those phrases that our Lord says that always takes my breath away. What? We'll do greater things than you, Lord. But of course he's doing that through us. But he did his, his life, his death, resurrection. That was a great gift to us. And I think this pattern of kenosis, what we call self-emptying, that you see in Lord of the Rings, you see in these two men, Tolkien and Lewis, is the pattern for all of us too. You plant a tree for the people that you're not going to actually, see. You're not going to see it, but they will. I think your book's going to also be in that category of a great gift to the world. All of your books are so good. Your most recent one that you came out with in 2021 was Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle Earth and Beyond the Middle Ages. That's a book to get through, and it's good. It's rich. It's so good. I took my high school theology class. We did a little apologetics course, and we read through your book, Not God's Type, your journey from being an atheist professor to becoming a Christian and into the Catholic Church, was a really fun read. So definitely check out those books and make a purchase. And then I loved your book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. I think every parish and church should have their staff read through that book. It's just so good. A lot of real practical tips and insights that I think we hear all of it, but it's kind of all in one place. So I would definitely encourage people to pick up a copy of the Apologetics and Christian Imagination. It's up there. I got a couple of your books up in the back. So, you can also find these books in the links. What's going on with maybe some other things with Word on Fire, with you and your work there? Your friend, Father Michael Ward, published a book a couple of years ago, After Humanity, related to Lewis's Abolition of Man. It's been neat to see kind of this Lewis Tolkien thing coming together at Word on Fire. What's going on there? How can we connect with the ministry, both buy your book, but also maybe donate to Word on Fire and support the work there?
Well, there's so many exciting things going on at Word on Fire that I wouldn't even hardly know where to begin. So just pick a few that I'm most aware of. Word on Fire's publishing has really been expanding. I had the great privilege of having Tolkien's Modern Reading be the first title in the academic line followed by After Humanity. And then there's been other titles since then. And Tolkien's Faith is going to also be in the academic line. And just seeing what they can do in terms of producing a beautiful book, because part of Word on Fire's commitment is to evangelizing through beauty, which means that you need to do everything with beauty. And so things like, well, the fact that the Tolkien's Faith has a 40-page full color photo gallery. They let me do that. 72 images. I thought, really, they'll let me do that? They let me do that. So I'm quite pleased about that. So there's a new children's line called Spark that's just being launched for Catholic children's books of, again, high quality, good stories, good quality illustrations. I'm very excited about Spark. So I would commend particularly any parents in your audience to check that out. So lots of good things. The Word on Fire Bible, which is amazing. So publishing is doing fantastic stuff. In the Institute, one thing that I'm particularly happy about is something that I'm doing myself, is that I'm supervising. If you're a member of the Institute, you join groups within it. And I run what are called the Emmaus writing groups. So they're small groups inspired by the Inklings and drawing from my experience as a teacher of writing, in which there, say 30 people in a group, and you get to know your fellow writers and you share your work for feedback. And every month I prepare a little bit of teaching about the process of writing, the spiritual aspect of writing, practical tips about writing. So I'm providing some content for these groups. And then everyone within each of the different groups, and I think we have 8 now, 8 small groups, they grow as we get more people, providing that kind of iron sharpening iron, and also support. So an encouraging kind of support for other writers. And I think this is really necessary for Christian writers, because we need fellowship so that people will feel encouraged and supported. I am so blessed that I have a great support network of friends who are also writers, who encourage me, who give me feedback, who just can talk about stuff with me. Writers, it may be me and my keyboard when I'm writing, but it's not just me when it comes to the whole process. So Christian writers need that, but they also need to be challenged to do better work, because one of my sort of pet peeves about Christian fiction in particular, but writing more broadly, is that we're really too quick to praise people for a good message and not challenge them to do really good work. Oh, what a good story. Well, yes, but are the characters really compelling, or are they cardboard? But it's a good message. Well, yes, but is it well written? Yeah.
Have you created your own Elven language yet?
Yeah. Well, we don't do Elven languages, but the point is, I really want to encourage people to allow themselves to be challenged, to take that next step and to do good work. Because as Christians, we should be desiring to do the very best work for God, not it has a nice message, so it's good enough work. So that's something that is a major part of my work at the Institute, is to lead these writing groups, which I'm sort of modestly hoping will help produce a little renaissance in Christian writing. We got
Praise be to God. That is amazing. I have 6 kids, and we're always trying to find them fiction to read. And you're right. There's not enough out there. And when they've read really good quality stuff, they can sniff out when something isn't that good. And so even if it's Christian, you're like, oh, this will be good, so good for you. They know that the character development isn't so good. So it's a great call. I think even just passing on the faith to my children, to our children, fiction is one of the most powerful ways to do that. So thank you for your work in that way. That is a great gem to share with others. Well, Dr. Holly Ordway, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a real pleasure to be having this conversation with you. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, great to have you. If you're watching this video, don't forget to share, subscribe, and again, pre-order that book. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Take care.
Thanks.